Can Europe save the world from a climate catastrophe? As the planet gets warmer, the EU unveils radical measures to become carbon neutral. But with potentially years of negotiations ahead, will the urgent plans be implemented in time? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the global climate emergency. Well, for decades, we've been warned about the dangers of climate change, but for too long, too little has been done to stop it. Scientists say we're running out of time to save the planet. Now, the effects of climate change are already being acutely felt by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Just take a look at what's been happening in North America. In June, Canada saw temperatures of almost 50 degrees Celsius, the highest ever recorded. Hundreds of people died in the heat. Even species living underwater weren't spared. More than 1 billion shellfish were literally cooked alive. And Canada's not alone. California's Death Valley broke the all-time heat record for the second year in a row. And as the planet gets hotter, wildfires are spreading more rapidly. Across the U.S., thousands have been forced to evacuate as giant flames tear through around a dozen states. So what needs to happen? Well, across the Atlantic, the European Union has announced an ambitious new plan to become the first carbon-neutral continent. Let's take a look at what they have in mind. Now, the bloc wants to ban the sale of new diesel and petrol-powered cars by 2035, introduce a tax on aviation and maritime fuel, and via a somewhat controversial proposal, impose a carbon border tax. Now, many of the world's richest nations argue it's too much too soon. But one of the planet's best-known climate activists, Greta Thunberg, says it actually doesn't go far enough. Taking to Twitter, she said, "So it's official. Unless the EU tears up their new #Fit455 package, the world will not stand a chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating. That's not an opinion. Once you include the full picture, it's a scientific fact. #mind the gap between words and action." Well, scientists are telling us time is running out, so what can we do to save ourselves? To discuss that, I'm joined now by Dann Mitchell, Associate Professor in Atmospheric Science at the University of Bristol. Alexandre Koberle is a Research Fellow at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London. And from Norwich is Rupert Read, a former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion and currently a member of the UK Green Party. He's also author of This Civilization is Finished: Conversations and On the End of an Empire, What Lies Beyond. Thanks all so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Rupert, let me start with you. The EU has put forth plans looking to become carbon neutral by 2055. That's a lot of enthusiasm around it, but we're already hearing reports now of infighting within the EU. What are the chances, do you think, that these plans will be fully implemented?
Well, that's hard to say. That depends on a lot of political contingencies. What I can say with confidence is that if the plans are implemented, it still won't be enough. The EU is saying, let's go carbon neutral by 2055. That's 34 years from now. It's a global climate emergency. How can an emergency be making things worse for the next 34 years? Because that's what we're doing if we're only aiming to go carbon neutral by 2055. We're making the emergency worse for every one of the next 34 years.
I'm going to stick with you for a second, Rupert, because you are the closest really to the politicians, I guess, on this issue. I mean, what and who could prevent real progress here based on these plans? Who or what is likely going to try to stop their implementation?
Well, obviously, there are going to be objections to these plans by any short-termist, profit-hungry industries that are uninterested in the fate of future generations, of indeed their own children. It's the ultimate stupidity for us not to be taking this emergency seriously as an emergency. So expect opposition from the auto manufacturers, from the energy producers, from the airline companies. And really, what's important, what's crucial for viewers to understand is that every bit of opposition is one more nail in the potential coffin of our children. It's as brutal and as simple as that. So the first thing I want to do really is to urge viewers, if you're dissatisfied with those who are standing in the way of plans like these, or as I say, plans that actually need to go further and faster, then please speak up and act on it. The decisions that are being made now will dictate the future because of the post-COVID reset period that we're in now. The decisions that are taken now are the decisions which are going to determine whether our children have a future.
Right. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to what Rupert said there, I think people get a little confused with when we talk about next 35 years till carbon neutrality. What they don't quite realise is that every day we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that carbon dioxide stays there for hundreds, in some cases thousands of years. So it's an emergency because every day of inaction leads to another hundred or thousands of years worth of CO2 in the atmosphere and that much climate change. So reducing emissions to zero by 30, 40, 50 years doesn't mean climate change stops at that threshold, carries on.
I mean, Dan, you clearly, obviously see this as an emergency. And even for those, I'll bring this up with you because I know this is one of your areas of specialization, even for those who do argue against the science itself, you know, taking measures to combat climate change, I would say is still, it's a win-win just for the effects it has on our health. Talk us through what it would mean just for us, even more selfish human beings who don't care that much about the wider planet, what it means for an individual to take these measures and help the planet for our own personal health.
Well, exactly. And we know warm temperatures have been linked with a number of health impacts, and they go from direct health impacts such as heat stroke and heat stress. We've seen a lot of that in the recent heat wave in Canada and the US. But there's a lot of indirect health impacts as well. And so we see links with things like dementia, where sleep is very important. And of course, if you have hot nights, it's harder to sleep. We see links with vector-borne diseases, and that might be malaria or dengue fever in the tropics. Or closer to home, it might just be things like ticks and Lyme disease. We see all of these links, and it impacts every country. And we've seen a detectable change in temperature-related mortality in every country now, every continent now, due to climate change. So for those people who think it's a sort of developing world problem, it's not. It's hitting people at home as well. So it needs to be taken serious, even by very rich countries. And US and Canada have seen that with the hundreds of deaths associated with this current heat wave.
Right. Alexandre, I'm sure you agree that this is tremendously urgent. So how important is it really for the EU to set an example, actually, at this point, for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I agree 100% with my panelist colleagues. The EU and North America have historically emitted the most greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So they are responsible for where we are currently. So I think that there's a moral, ethical prerogative here for the EU to lead by example. And it's also, those are the two wealthiest regions in the world, so they would have arguably the capacity to do so, to make the investments and to make the transitions and to absorb some of the structural economic difficulties that will come along with that, like, for example, shifting jobs from one industry to another, making sure that nobody's left behind. No, people, for example, who work in the coal industry, they stand to lose their jobs, so they need to be reskilled and retrained so that they can work in other industries that will emerge. So new industries will be appearing while old industries may disappear. So this transition needs to be managed in a way that it happens in an orderly fashion.
Right. Alexandre, let me stick with you, and I want to play devil's advocate for a second, because climate skeptics are going to argue that there were climatic changes on this planet before that were so powerful that they actually wiped out dinosaurs. I mean, the Sahara Desert was a green oasis thousands of years ago. So how can we really be so sure that there aren't other factors at play and that this isn't part of a progression that was going to happen anyway, in which case we should be taking advantage of everything the planet has to offer us since it was going down on its own.
Well, I think probably Dan will be a better position to address this question that has to do more with atmospheric physics. But one of the things that I can say is that the changes that we're seeing now in terms of greenhouse gas concentrations, temperature increase, are unprecedented in the pace, in the speed with which they're occurring. So yeah, there were changes in the past, but they were much more gradual. And also, these were changes that happened hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago. For the last 800,000 years, the global climate has been somewhat stable around an interval where current life forms have adjusted and adapted to, and ecosystems have positioned themselves to be able to absorb some of the extremes. If this changes too suddenly, these species and ecosystems will have a hard time adjusting. And this includes, for example, agricultural crops. So those are life forms that we have domesticated. And if they are not given the time to adjust to these changes, we may be facing significant risk in terms of food security.
Right. Okay, Dan, I also want to put that question to you then. I mean, how can we be so sure that this isn't a natural progression, that maybe we're speeding up marginally because we don't even fully understand volcanic activity, for example, that's really happening beneath the surface that we can't properly monitor or predict? Go ahead.
Well, yes, and just to say, I agree with everything Alexandre just said. On top of that, we have incredibly complex models of our climate system. These are some of the most complex models in science, full stop. And we've tested them very rigorously, and they've held up. We developed them 40 or 50 years ago, and they've predicted the climate very well of today, for instance. So we know they work very well. And in those models, we can switch on and we can switch off certain processes. And we've switched on the processes which have acted over millions of years. So the changes in orbital parameters of our planet, the changes in solar output of our planet. And we can't reproduce our current warming. The only way we can reproduce our current warming is when we switch on the human-induced carbon dioxide component. That's probably our strongest line of evidence that climate change is real, but we have over 100 lines of evidence, and really the IPCC says that we're 95% confident in the human-induced surface warming. In reality, scientists are much more confident in that. We just have to be a bit cautious.
Okay.
So our theories are all pointing in the same direction.
Rupert, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that last point because it's crucial what Dan said there. This science is, if anything, too cautious. We constantly hear, even now, it's completely absurd about these so-called climate skeptics, but actually the concern should be on the other foot, if anything, that we're not doing enough to go with the underlying thrust of the science, and that scientists have sometimes leant over backwards to accommodate any potential doubts. The thing which we really ought to notice, for example, is that whenever there's been any issues with the science over the past 20 years or so, it's been because it's underestimated the extent and the scale of change. For example, the rate of melting at the ice caps has been, if anything, underestimated by the models. So to be honest, the question you should be asking the scientists is the other way around.
It's fascinating, too, because there was just a report out of the Amazon that the Amazon forest that we always considered the sponge for carbon is now actually becoming a bigger producer than it is absorber of carbon. Alexandre, I saw you had a comment as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this issue of underestimation, because there's so much uncertainty in how climate influences the weather, usually you run these models several times and you're dealing with statistics, and what you have then is what's reported as a result is the average or the median, so the middle ground. And what you lose by doing that is those very dangerous possibilities at the very extremes. So there's those low frequency but very high impact events, like, for example, this heat wave that happened in North America is a very good example of something like that. So very low probability. It was estimated to be 1 in 1,000 year heat wave, but it has very large impacts by causing things like death and economic loss, agricultural loss, and so on. So if we keep talking about the average possibilities of the future, we miss out on these very dangerous possibilities that are small possibilities, but if we go there, we may stand to lose a lot.
Right. Rupert, let me come back to you because, you know, there are those who argue that these measures are just never worth the cost, really, that they pose to human development. So, I mean, can we have both? Can we continue to have human prosperity via a constantly growing economy and growing consumption without consuming the planet itself?
The simple answer is no. And that's why this is somewhere sometimes shied away from. We have to question our growth model. We have to question our fundamental economic model. We have to ask whether there are more important things in life than ever more consumption. And in my opinion, there are more important things in life, such as life itself, such as the love that we bear for our children. If we want there to be a future, we need to rein in the out of control economic model, the out of control industrial system that is consuming the very planet that we live on. I'm not saying we have to go back and live in caves or all the other nonsense that the opponents of serious action throw at us. What I'm saying is, are we prepared to actually take a stand and ensure that our children have a future? Are we determined to just carry on consuming like there's no tomorrow? Because if we carry on consuming like there's no tomorrow, there'll be no tomorrow.
Right. You know, the flip side of that, though, is that part of the model, the economic model, you know, that we feel destroys the planet is actually crucial, some will argue, to human survival. I was talking about the Amazon before. A lot of why the Amazon rainforest is being burnt, Dan, I'll put this to you, is for massive agricultural production. I mean, Brazil is a huge food exporter, and that feeds into the argument that we need that land to produce food to continue humanity's survival. So, Dan, I mean, how do you argue and change that trajectory?
Well, I mean, there's certain easy wins with climate change. Agriculture is not one of them. I don't feel, and I don't necessarily buy some of the arguments where people say we should all sort of turn to vegetarians and save the planet that way. There's a human psychology component to the climate crisis, and that's probably the hardest part of climate change. And so, you know, cutting down large areas of forest, it's really hard just to change the nature of people to get to change that sort of angle. I guess it's not something I've thought about too much. I suspect my colleagues on this panel will know more on that subject, though.
Yeah, Alexander, I saw you wanted to comment. Go ahead.
So you use Brazil as an example. The issue of linking deforestation to agricultural production goes through the conversation about agricultural productivity and yield. There is a component in Brazil specifically, I'm talking about Brazil specifically now, that deforestation is not necessarily driven by a necessity of increasing production. You could increase production in the existing land if that land became more productive through a little bit of investment. For example, Brazil has 200 million hectares of very unproductive, on average, pasture land. If you increase the productivity of that pasture land by 10%, you would save 20 million hectares. That is a third of the current cropland in Brazil. So what's driving deforestation in the Amazon is not necessarily a necessity to make to produce more food, but it's actually driven by land grabbing, land tenure issues, lack of governance, and it's just a way for land speculators to take possession of land and then gain title to that land. That's how historically the expansion of agriculture into the Amazon took place. It has come down, it has been controlled a little bit, but last few years, there has been a systematic dismantling of the Brazilian monitoring, verification, and enforcement arm of the environmental law enforcement in Brazil. So it is a bigger problem. It's not so you cannot just link it to producing food. There's much
Okay.
more that's involved there in deforestation.
Fair enough. I'd like to move into another area, if you don't mind. Rupert, let me ask you this. While the world was fighting climate change, we've also been fighting the coronavirus pandemic. What did you get to observe during the extremely rare event that, major industries were shut down, air traffic was eliminated, traffic jams were non-existent? How much did those months kind of allow the planet to heal and human health to improve? Or did you disappointingly maybe see the opposite effect?
Well, what we did see was that in the short run, there was a very significant drop in the carbon emissions that were pouring out, and a slight improvement in the position of nature. What the coronavirus showed us in our response to it was that it is possible for us to change everything overnight if we're really determined to do so, if we see the vividness of the threat before us. The climate crisis is very like the coronavirus crisis, only it's much, much slower. So whereas the coronavirus crisis worked on the speed of weeks and months, the climate crisis works on the speed of years and decades. It's therefore harder for human beings to adjust to. A very clever quip that was made on this a few years ago by an observer of the situation. He said, people say the climate crisis is happening much too fast. Actually, it's much too slow. It's too slow for human attention. What we need to do is act as if the climate crisis is like the coronavirus crisis, only much, much worse, because it is much, much worse. And the hope that we have from the coronavirus crisis is that if we can apply those lessons, and if we can think about climate along the lines that we thought about corona, as urgent, as crucial, well, then maybe it's not too late to save ourselves.
Right. Dan, I'm wondering to what extent an opportunity was actually squandered during the pandemic to let the planet recover even more. I mean, we seemed to actually cancel out the industrial pollution by creating obscene amounts of non-biodegradable waste in the form of plastic wrapping in containers and then non-biodegradable PPE even.
Well, yeah, I mean, COVID raised as many issues as it did solve for climate change. And one of the things that was really obvious was that the whole world was going through clearly an extreme event in COVID. And we got to see how extreme climate change and extreme COVID interacted, and it never worked out well. Some very obvious examples there are a heat wave in India last year. All the doctors were in full PPE, more so than usual. They couldn't sweat away the temperatures. It was horrendous there, especially in the overpopulated city that it is. And then there was tropical cyclones, otherwise known as hurricanes, hitting, for instance, Bangladesh. A particularly bad one called Super Cyclone Amphan hit. And what happened there was none of the emergency services were in place because they were dealing with COVID. None of the emergency predictions were in place. Well, some were. And lots of people went into cyclone shelters and, of course, clustered together in a time when you were trying to be separated because of restrictions. And so there was lots of issues there. And again, it was just another insight of climate change is not the only thing going on. But as we keep climate change going on, we have to deal with crises on top of climate change. And we saw that with COVID very clearly.
Right. I mean, Alexander, it seems that we're going to struggle to get the EU plan implemented. What do you fear is really the worst case scenario now?
Well, the worst case scenario is that we don't do anything. I think that even though there are limitations to this particular proposal, in that it doesn't go far enough to deliver on, for example, the Paris Agreement's net zero 1.5 degrees, for example. It is a major first step, and I think it needs to be supported, not shut down. It needs to be pushed forward and made more ambitious. So the first thing to do is to bring consensus so that this something gets passed that will get us somewhere, and then to allow some flexibility so it can be ratcheted up.
Right.
There will need to be more ambition that's going to have to be built into it in a later stage. But at this point, I think we need to just keep moving forward. We cannot stop or move backwards.
Yeah, I want to lighten it up a bit, if that's possible, before we go. One of my favorite cartoons I ever saw on climate change was Joel Pett, rather. He's a prize-winning cartoonist out of the United States, and he made the point that, you know, as for the climate skeptics, actually, we're missing an opportunity for a win-win. You know, even if you don't believe the science behind climate change, we're just missing an opportunity to help the planet and make it better for all of us. I think we can all have a little laugh at that and agree on it as well. That's going to have to leave it on that note. And I'd like to thank really all three of you so much for being with us for this discussion on climate change. And thanks for watching The Newsmakers. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.